Greetings, traveler. Often I get questions about the Senmongako system in Japan, which is basically a vocational school system or an alternative to the typical university type of education. What it offers is courses specifically geared towards game development and game-related fields, and they also promise a almost guaranteed job in the games industry for those who graduate. It sounds like a pretty good deal, right? Well, having been through that and having been through university myself, I want to give my thoughts on it based on how I experienced it, what I think the good, the bad, and the ugly of it is, and hopefully shed a little light in this situation before somebody out there decides to jump in and see for themselves. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in Japan for 13 years now, and I have been in a Senmongako for 3 years. And my experience was after having graduated university. So I did my computer science degree, and then I came over to Japan. And being young and foolish back then, I thought, well, I don't know anything about the games industry in Japan. That's where I wanted to work. That's what I wanted to do. So while I was still in my Japanese language school, I saw these advertisements for a vocational school that specialized in game development. So I thought probably they know how to get into the Japanese games industry, so I should go there. As I said, I was young and foolish. So today what I want to do is give a brief introduction about what the system entails and what my opinion is about its features, and based on that, hopefully you can make your own mind if this would be something interesting for you, traveler. But also I will give you in the end what my takeaway is from going through these systems and what I think the alternatives are. So let's jump in. What is expected of a Senmongako? Well, it's pretty similar to the vocational schools in Europe or the US as I understand it. The main difference is that where in a university you would have university professors who teach a bunch of subjects, in vocational school you don't have professors, you have industry professionals. So instead of let's say going to university and studying advanced mathematics taught in a very academic way, in a vocational school you would have a programmer who has worked as a games programmer for a number of years and now is teaching some subjects. I think that's the most basic difference here. I think that's the most important part to understand, and you will see throughout this explanation how this shapes the process and what the expectations are. The other big expectation from universities is that hopefully you get placed into a job, or hopefully you do some sort of an internship that either becomes a job in the future or it gives you relevant experience so you can pursue other jobs in the future. In the Senmongako system, it's basically an untold promise or an assumed promise that nobody makes, that as soon as you graduate, then you will have a job secured and everything is going to be great. So there's a lot of specifics to go into here and a lot of different little things to talk about. So let's start. So let's start with the good of the Senmongako system. So having access to real people who are actually working in the games industry and have done so for many, many years. Some of my professors had been had been professionals in the industry for more than 30 years. So they have seen a good chunk of the games industry's history. They have been part of it. So being able to pick their brain and ask them questions about the good old days is very, very interesting. It's very educational. And seeing how the industry evolved and what they learned is also a really, really cool thing to ask them about. Also, if you can have specific enough questions, then they can provide specific answers. The downside, well, anyway, we'll talk about the downside later. Another very good thing about the Senmongakos is that perhaps it's easier to get into than a university. Universities typically need a lot of money to get into, or very, very high scores in high school. Senmongakos usually, or vocational schools in Japan, are not usually that picky. University education is not required, although depending on your visa situation and your high school situation, they'll be a little picky. But in my experience, there was no particular sticking point with that. Something that is a requirement, of course, is Japanese language proficiency. So if you're familiar with the Japanese language tests, then an N1 degree is sort of needed unless you can demonstrate that your communication ability is amazing already. And I think that goes for Japan in general. If you can demonstrate that your communication ability is good face to face with people, then usually people are not so picky about asking for your diploma and your papers and so on. But that's just my experience so far. Another good thing about the Senmongako system is that while you're attending this school, there's a couple of cool events that you can participate in. I've spoken before about how I was lucky enough to be selected for the Inafune Juku. That's Keiji Inafune's 6-month seminars. You can get to ask him about his Mega Man or Rockman days. You can ask him about what it's like to be a legendary game creator and so on. That was pretty cool. Another cool thing is that there's access to the Tokyo Game Show. The school usually had a booth there, and students can show off their projects in the booth of the school. Of course, the students don't have to pay anything extra. And the booth itself is situated in a school's area, so people who go to that area in the Tokyo Game Show are looking for young, talented people or for fresh ideas to incorporate into their companies or into their teams. So having that is a cool thing, for sure. Being able to have that experience was definitely interesting. I got to talk to a lot of really cool, high-ranking people from many of the most famous games companies here in Japan and worldwide. So that was definitely a cool experience. Finally, the good part of the Senmongako system is that assuming you are someone who is actively interested in game development in any of its subfields, and you attend the classes and you pass the courses and so on, then there's a very, very high chance that the school will promote you to one of its associated gaming companies in gaming positions, and you will be able to start working there as a new hire when you graduate from the vocational school. Now, this is sort of assumed, and it's an unspoken promise, and of course there's no guarantee this will happen. The school will do its best effort to show off your work and introduce you to companies who might be interested, but there is no obligation from the companies to hire you, and there is no promise from the school that you will be placed in a company. So here, I suppose, is the place where each individual student's effort shows, and at least the school provides the opportunity for you to have a channel to talk to these people who work in other game companies, and have at least a few moments to show off your work and get to talk to them and make a case for yourself. So that's definitely a cool part of the system. Let's jump into some less fortunate parts of the system, according to my experience, of course. So because the teachers in the Senmongakos are professionals and not university teachers, there is very little structure or no structure to the courses. What do I mean by that? So let's say that somebody wants to teach you mathematics or a certain area of mathematics over a semester. That is a formal subject. That is something that everybody around the world agrees on the rules on. In math, for example, there is no disagreement about how math works. Everybody has the accepted form of mathematics, and in every single course, a certain chunk of it is broken down into lessons, and through a semester you're supposed to get from here to here in this in this chunk of mathematics. This doesn't happen as such in Senmongakos. Each lesson is more like, here's some theory. It's not particularly connected to anything. Anyway, let's jump in and make a game. But what game you make is up to you, and how you make it is up to you, and there's no real deadline and there's no real expectation. The teachers might suggest in their own way what the project should be or how quickly it should be completed. But because, of course, every student continues at their own pace, even if students are gathered into groups to get together and make a game project, there's no guarantee on the outcome. So a lot of the time, most of the time, these game creation sessions, even though they span months and have multiple team members, usually they don't actually produce anything meaningful. It's still an interesting exercise and it's better than nothing, I suppose. But having experienced university as well, I definitely think that this kind of experience, because it has no expectation built in the end, usually amounts to nothing. And it's very easy for teams that have low motivation students to just achieve nothing in the end. This was definitely one of the negative points going through this system. The other part that's connected to this is very low accountability for the students. So what this means is that if there's a course, and in that course you're supposed to learn how to use a piece of software or a development process and so on, if you don't manage to do that, that's okay. And this is where things get a little eerie. So perhaps this was just a thing of the school that I attended, but I figured out at some point that if I completed no assignments and I produced no amount of work, and I'm talking 0 here, then all I would have to do for a course is at the end of the course do some sort of little super easy makeup exercise. And if I could just deliver that one extremely simple exercise compared to the actual content of the course, then that would be enough to get a passing grade. And since at the end of this system you don't get a grade, there's no such thing as a grade for your diploma, or if there is, it's completely irrelevant and no company is going to look at that. Getting a passing grade is all you need to complete the system. So it sounds very free on one hand, but on the other you could just cruise through everything, not really learn anything, not really be accountable for everything, and just wonder what was the point of all this in the end. Definitely a strange part of the system. So I touched a little bit on this already. There is very random content on the courses. So you imagine that going through a game development school of sorts, there would be some structure, and you would say, okay, to learn how to make a game, there's these 5 subsections. Let's study them one by one, and by the end we'll have a concept in our mind about how to make a game. That does not exist. There is no concept of this is how you make a game. No one will ever say this is how you make a game. And I know you might think, well, games are very free things and everybody has their own process. Yes, that's true. But in order to decide, what's good for you and what process suits you, especially if you don't know anything in the beginning, if you're going to a school to be educated about it, then the assumption is that there is a structure that's introduced by the school, and then you can choose which parts of it you like and which ones you don't like, or hopefully there is several processes presented. There is type A process and type B process and so on, and you can think, yeah, I like this type C one, so let's go with that. That also doesn't exist. Each course has whatever the teacher thinks is interesting at the time. And even though individually, these are all cool subjects, there is no how-to here. That doesn't exist. And this, I think, is a very negative point. Let me give you a side example to explain this. So let's say you want to learn how to make pastries and cakes. So you go to a school to teach you how to make cakes. The expectation is that they will say something like, well, to make a basic cake, you need the flour and the milk and the eggs and the butter, and you mix them all together and you bake it and you have a cake. Now, if you want a different type of cake, we can also teach you how to make these other types too. But there is a basic explanation and a basic concept of what a cake is and how to make it, at least in its basic form. And from there you can go and make crazy and variable and alternative new cakes. Imagine instead if you went to the cake school and instead of teaching you how to make a basic cake, they said, well, here's a history of cakes and here's an image of a cake and here's what somebody wrote about a cake. And that's where the education ended. That would be extremely disappointing to the person who had the expectation that by going to a cake school, I would assume I can make a cake. So hopefully this example makes sense, and you can see how all this random content about individual topics here and there. So let's analyze one character from one game, or here's some piece of code to teach you how to calculate angles, and here's the history of zodiac signs. All these are topics that actually I was taught in the Senmongaku that I attended, and these are cool topics. There's nothing wrong with the topic, but as there's some, or individually, they do not answer the question, how doth a game make? So that I thought was very problematic and definitely a negative in the process. And let's get to the ugly side. So they can be expensive. Senmongakos can be expensive. What's expensive to everyone is up to interpretation. Everybody has a different opinion about this, rightly so. But for the type of education they offer, I find them extremely expensive. And yes, there's the opportunity of employment in the future. But this is connected to the second ugly point. Yes, if you do all the things that I mentioned, so you're motivated and your skills are good enough and so on, yes, you might get hired by a company, but it will be the absolute bottom grade job there is. So minimum wage, very, very, very junior position, age is irrelevant, skill level is irrelevant. To put it in different words, let's say there's a 30-year-old expert student who's good at programming, and there's a 20-year-old completely junior student whose skill is basically so low he can barely understand code. These two would be hired with the same conditions, and they would be paid the same salary. And of course, in the future, they can have a different career, and it's all up to them, and so on. Yes, that's true, but that beginning is a bit strange, and I think it's definitely the ugly side of the system. There is no meritocracy here. There is no judgment of your skills. It's that, are you good enough to work somewhere? Okay, you're hired, or you're not hired. It's definitely what I thought was a very, very weird part of the system. Another one is that it's very, very time consuming. So these Senmongakos, some of them are short, they're just a year. Some of them are 2, 3, or 4 years. The one that I attended was 3 years long. And that was obscenely long. There was no necessity for such a long curriculum. The added time did not add any value to the education itself. If I were to be studying the same topics individually, I could finish them in less than a semester. There wasn't that much of material to cover that 3 years were necessary in order to cover it. It definitely felt time consuming. It definitely felt like we were just sitting around, like idling basically all the time. And then when I dug deeper into it, I found out another ugly side of the system where, for someone, they might For someone else, they might think this is just normal and expected, but I thought it was a bit odd. There is the visa lock. What do I mean by that? So if you don't have a Japanese visa and you want to come to Japan to study, if you're going, let's say, to a language school, the situation is a bit different, because the agreement with language schools is that the school will provide the visa for the student to come over and study in Japan. Now, language schools are a bit different because they don't have a set length in their curriculum. Sure, you can study for several years, but there's people who also come and study for just 2 weeks, for example. So 2 weeks or 3 months or 6 months or just under a year and so on. And the system with language schools is so that the visa is adaptable to the length of the studies. So if you study for 6 months and you decide that's enough, then you can stop the visa right there. That is not the case with senmongakos. There, the visa is tied to the length of the curriculum. So if you attend a senmongako for 3 years, then your visa is tied to that. So you cannot stop the school in the meantime. So you cannot stop after 1 year, for example, and go work for a games company. You cannot. And this is a very rigid, very hard limitation that the more I looked into, the more odd it seemed to me. Why is that the case? It's because the Japanese government allows institutions like that, like the language school, the senmongakos, to provide a visa for students on the condition that students undertake the courses and not do something else. So if the student takes a visa but doesn't attend the courses, so they're having a lot of absences in the classes, then the Japanese government interprets that as the student not fulfilling his promise of getting a visa to attend the school because he's obviously skipping classes. So why are we providing a visa for this guy? Conversely, the school is in trouble as well, because the government's agreement with the school is that they let them provide visas for the students on the assumption that the students do what they say they do. So they study in this school. So if they study for 1 year and then they stop the school to go work somewhere, even though that there's nothing evil about that process, in fact, the whole point of going to the school is so that you can find a job in the games industry here, that is seen as a negative thing. And if a student does that, then the school gets in trouble because the school didn't fulfill its agreement with the government. And if enough students stop their visa to start working somewhere, then the school gets in trouble, and basically the government takes away their power of being able to grant visas to future students. And of course, for the student, it's a problematic situation, because canceling a school visa like that is going to stay in the record. And when that student applies for a normal working visa and so on, that is going to be something that's going to be in the record. Perhaps it's going to be examined more deeply, perhaps not. Perhaps there's going to be questions. There is the possibility of future visas being denied or being more difficult to be granted. It definitely creates issues. So all that is to say, and of course I'm not working in the government, and I'm not a visa lawyer, so I cannot provide all the information about this. I'm just talking about what I found out and my specific experience. But these are real answers that I got from people in my school when I looked into this topic. So even though there was a company that wanted to hire me already from my first year, then I couldn't switch to full-time employment to that company, and I had to stay as a part-time worker in the beginning. So these are all the reasons and the answers that were given to me when I looked into this topic. So I think by now you have an understanding of at least what I experienced in the system and what people told me about it here, what my experiences were. So you might be thinking now, well, what do I do? Do I go for this thing or do I do something else? It's a good question. It's definitely a good question. My advice, if I can give such an advice, would be what I always say, and say, if you can instead learn all this from a friend you make in the games industry, by all means, that would be my recommendation to my younger self. Instead of going through the system and going through classes that seem pointless and take too long and so on, forget about all that. After obtaining enough Japanese language skills to work in Japan, making friends in the games industry and asking them what sort of skills are necessary is a way better route to take. Because once you know what skills are necessary to be, let's say, a game designer or a game engine programmer or a character artist and so on, once you know that, you can sit down and study it by yourself and be done way faster than 6 months. If you focus on studying something specific, you'll find that, or at least I found, that it takes an extremely short amount of time compared to what any school or any course advertises. That's just my experience with these things. However, if you like the prospect of having to pay, a substantial amount of money, and you don't mind the prospect of a very, very low-grade entry-level job, and you also like these opportunities here and the events and how accessible it is and so on, and you do have a plan in mind for making the most out of the professionals who teach in vocational schools, perhaps that is a way forward if that is what is interesting to you. Anyway, that has been my experience. These are some of the things that I didn't know when I jumped into the situation. That's why I said in the beginning I was young and foolish to make that choice when I did, but perhaps it's different for some other person. So I wanted to make sure that this information was out there. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, and as always, have fun.